Not even the F-18 Hornet has been able to carry the duties of the F-14 Tomcat, and now we wonder why it's still been missed. That's why the F-14 Tomcat will be the best fighter ever designed. Too expensive to maintain? Oh yeah, that F-35B is a real money saver. F-14 Tomcat, best fighter aircraft ever? Tomcat, the MiG Master. Can an F-14 beat an F-22? F-14 Bombcat, the US Navy's ultimate precision bomber.
In 1960, Strategic Air Command had switched to low-level penetration attacks to increase the probability of bombers making it to their targets. That May, Gary Powers was shot down by an SA-2 missile, proving that aircraft flying above 60,000 feet could be intercepted by SAMs, and that the change was definitely the right decision. At this time, tactical strike aircraft like the A-4 and the F-105 were already making low-level nuclear attacks, and Tactical Air Command was interested in developing this style of attack further, as it also had significant potential with conventional weapons. The F-105 was an excellent aircraft in its own right, but one of its major drawbacks was that it had an excessive takeoff roll. Studies by NASA showed the promise of swing wings, and so a specification for a replacement aircraft known as SOR-183 was drawn up. Meanwhile, in the Navy, the threat of Russian land-based maritime bombers was becoming more serious by the day. The F-3H Demon, F-4 Phantom, and the cancelled F-16 Missileer were all developed to challenge this threat. However, the Navy didn't think this was enough, as the new Tu-22 Blinder was faster and a greater threat than any other Soviet bomber before. The Navy wanted a big jet with lots of range for loitering ability, and a longer range missile than the Sparrow. Their work was limited to feasibility studies, but it called for a swing-wing design to help lower the landing speed, as the F-4 was considered too fast on the landing approach to carriers. The Navy didn't get very far before Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara came in and just told the Navy to use the Air Force's design. His line of thinking, if you could call it that, was that since the two services both needed a twin-engine, two-seat supersonic aircraft with swing wings and both were meant to carry heavy loads, they could use a unified airframe. The fact that the Air Force wanted a low-level bomber and the Navy wanted a high-altitude interceptor didn't really seem to get through to his hamster-powered brain, and he pushed forward with the plan regardless of both services' understandable protests. To give a bit of context, McNamara was big on inter-service commonality to reduce operating costs of the massive air fleets of both the Air Force and Navy. In fact, he had a massive history of advocating for consolidation in the name of so-called efficiency and cost-cutting. During the Second World War, he worked for the Army Air Force as a statistician to analyze the efficiency of B-29s, and he devised strategies for cargo planes flying over the hump. He was behind the USAF adopting the A-7 and the F-4. He was also behind a lot of the rules of engagement in Vietnam that tied the hands of American pilots behind their back. We're really getting sidetracked. The point is, this is a guy who thinks he knows a lot more than he actually does. McNamara was led into a sense of complacency that since the Phantom and the Corsair worked out, that the TFX program would work out pretty much in the same vein. He didn't really take into account the delicate politics of the two services and underestimated how far the Navy would go just to get their own plane. See, after the Air Force was basically strong-armed by him into adopting two Navy designs, the Navy was on a bit of a high and just began assuming that they built better airplanes. To adopt an Air Force ground attacker as their newest fighter was simply unthinkable. There was an existing bias against the Air Force designs in the Navy even before McNamara's meddling. The F-86 Sabre was adapted for carrier ops and renamed the FJ-2 or 3 Fury. But the Navy insisted throughout its entire service life that it was too dangerous for carrier ops, and when they were also desperately trying to force the F-7U Cutlass into service. Anyways, as a result of the required unified airframe, the General Dynamics proposal was picked over the Boeing proposal, which was the Air Force's preferred design. Actually, not just preferred, the Source Selection Board unanimously declared Boeing the winner of the TFX 3 times. Nearly everyone thought the two services were going to get their own aircraft, until McNamara, in his infinite wisdom, fired the selection board and sent Boeing to the drawing board again. After the 818 won a fourth time, McNamara went and looked over the design himself, ignored everything from the lower costs, meeting each service's requirements better, and innovative design, and zoomed in on the low commonality between the two variants. This did not make the McNamara happy. He had an incredibly stupid idea that since Grumman had a history of designing small fighter aircraft, and Boeing had a background in larger aircraft, the joint General Dynamics and Grumman design would be superior. This is called confirmation bias, kids. With McNamara firmly pushing his decisions through the sludge of bureaucracy known as the US government, the Navy began making plans on how to, under absolutely no circumstances, allow the 111 be accepted into service. Well, see, regardless of what company was declared the winner, the Navy wouldn't have accepted the Air Force design due to pride. The reports of the F-111 having poor handling, that it wasn't suitable for carrier ops, there isn't enough thrust in Christendom to make a fighter out of that jet, are all lies that came out of inter-service politics. The Navy went so far as to sabotage the design of the aircraft. The Air Force originally wanted an aircraft with tandem seating, that is, the pilot sits ahead of the weapons officer. In fact, the original prototype looked strikingly similar to the Tornado. But the Navy insisted upon a side-by-side seating arrangement so that the pilot and the weapons officer could look at the same radar screen, a very attack jet-like configuration. When the Navy finally got out of the F-111 program, the F-14 got tandem seating. Funny that. The Navy also insisted that the size and weight of the F-111 was grounds for its dismissal. Let's take a look at some basic stats. The F-14 is 19.13 meters long compared to the F-111 at 22.4 meters. The F-14 is 19.5 meters in wingspan while the F-111 is 19 meters. Both are about 5 meters tall, and both are roughly 20,000 kilograms empty, though the 111 is about 10,000 kilograms more at full load because it carries more fuel. What's really puzzling is that the 111 was never tested aboard carriers until after it was cancelled, and only when Secretary of the Navy Paul Ignatius, I don't know how to pronounce it, Paul absolutely insisted upon it. Legendary test pilot Pete Pettigrew flew the test. He scored a MiG-21 kill over Vietnam while flying from the USS Kitty Hawk, the only Top Gun instructor to do so. He also actually made a cameo in the movie. But anyways, he notes, it flew a nice approach, wasn't too fast, and performed well in the ball. They were pretty happy with it. So generally we can dismiss the Navy's claims regarding the F-111B as untrustworthy. There was a major issue that did plague the TFX that I will admit was a real problem, that was the TF-30. It was also used on the A-7. During violent maneuvers that combat aircraft tend to perform, the TF-30 had a very inappropriate tendency to compressor stall. Towards the end of the F-111's development cycle, which was the late 60s, a redesigned intake had completely solved this problem. The TF-30 equipped F-14A went into service with this issue, and the F-14B/D only came online in the late 80s and 90s in very small numbers. They never fixed the design actually, they just installed a completely different engine. A-model Tomfats, which still made up the majority of the fleet even in 2006, still had compressor stall issues. Secretary of the Navy John Lemon is famously quoted as saying this about the TF-30. The F-14 is probably the worst engine-airplane mismatch we've had in many years. The TF-30 is just a terrible engine. As a matter of fact, the TF-30 gave the Navy a very useful scapegoat. It wasn't the engine, but the F-14's intake design that troubled the engine. It worked just fine in the A-7 and the F-111, both of which have extensive service records and neither of which have any issues in combat or peacetime. This misinformation is just another way for the Navy to attribute F-14's actual poor performance to something unrelated to themselves or the airframe, when it is actually both of those which are responsible. I bring this up as an example to the F-111B's situation. It was starting to mature as a prototype, and from a purely technical standpoint was proving promising should it actually enter serial production. The problem is, as our friend, Paul noted, was that the Navy had a, quote, emotional problem with the plane, and that even if the F-111B turned out to be an excellent airplane, the Navy still wouldn't want it. As a quick side note, Kara Hultgreen's death is directly because of this disgrace. It cannot be overstated how her death has been so mishandled by politics. Had she been flying an F-4 and F-18, she would not be dead right now, unless she got into a car crash or something. I don't know. Life happens. Contrary to what the Navy would have you believe, she had average grades, and from all accounts was a good and capable pilot. The Squadron XO replicated the failure 100 times in a simulator, and 97 of those times died, as it were. Instead of blaming the actual problem, which was the equipment, she was used as a sort of political whacking stick to silence those in favor of allowing women in the military. Third wave feminism hadn't happened yet, but hey, women drivers, am I right? When McNamara finally resigned in 1968, the Navy used the exit of the 111's greatest proponent to get rid of their unwanted bird. They sent all the prototypes to the boneyard and scrapped the airframes unceremoniously. This was the irony of the TFX. The admirals got their way in the end. Boeing was right, as the TFX as an Air Force-Navy joint venture failed. With the withdrawing from the program, the economics of the F-111 program was utterly destroyed, and the Air Force's 111 cost skyrocketed. I can't say if it was an intended side effect or not, but I can imagine the Navy cackling at one last spiteful wrench thrown in the Air Force's plans. The Aardvark entered service with a host of design compromises that were completely unnecessary, and it neutered the jet in a way. Mike Glenn, a young maintenance supervisor for Hughes, the company that made the Phoenix missile, believes that the Navy should have bought 48 111s as a stopgap so that the Navy had some time to fully develop the F-14, and I fully agree with this sentiment. He said, by the last F-111B built, Grumman and GD had worked out the bugs. I will tell you that prototype number 7 could fly circles around our early F-14s, longer, faster, and very maintenance friendly compared to our earlier F-111Bs and F-14s. This is why I went so far as to dig into the origins of the TFX earlier. Boeing had two slightly differing aircraft that served both services' needs, and McNamara took an axe to it. Then, when he finally got his inferior type to be moved forward, the Navy did everything it could to discredit and destroy the 111. Then, they went and made their own jet, which was inferior to that jet. It's one of the main reasons that Aardvark's reputation is in the gutter, the other being the reformers who spread this misinformation far and wide. The Navy quickly gave a new contract to Grumman. They created the prototype G303, which became the F-14. The Navy was eyeing the Air Force's FX program, which was quickly looking to be a formidable rival to the G303. And in part due to needing to get the Phoenix capability into the fleet as soon as possible, and in part because of the big show they made of shitting on Air Force design competence, the Navy had effectively politicaled themselves into a corner, which they had to rush the F-14 into service ahead. The first F-14 prototype flew a mere 22 months after the contract was awarded, and the jet entered service in 1973, a development cycle not including the F-111B, shorter than that of some airliners. The aforementioned TF-30 problem was actually not the F-14's greatest enemy in life. The real trouble came from the slew of soft factor failings in the design. Soft factors are generally overlooked by hard factors, which are raw combat statistics, such as top speed, rate of climb, maneuverability, etc. The kind of things that matter in a game like War Thunder or Digital Combat Simulator. I'll talk about both, starting with soft factors, which I personally believe to be more important. The swing wings on the F-14 were meant to reduce the landing speed and improve the low-speed handling characteristics of the F-14 over the F-4. While the F-4 had surprisingly predictable handling at low speeds, the Navy considered its 140 or 145 knot approach speed to be way too high, and wanted it lowered to help their pilots on final approach and reduce the stresses of catching the wire for both the ship and the aircraft. While Grumman did manage to lower the F-14's approach speed down to an incredible 125 knots, they sure as hell didn't achieve the design goal of reducing the stresses on the tailhook of wire. Let's do a little math. 125 knots is 64.3 meters a second, which is for the Tomcat. 145 knots is 76.6 meters a second for the Phantom. 35 knots is 18 meters a second, which is the speed I'm assuming the carrier is sailing to bring aircraft back on board. The F-4 is 13,757 kilograms empty, and will add 1,000 kilograms of fuel and no missiles because the F-4 has commonly returned to the carrier without any weapons remaining. The F-14 is 19,838 kilograms empty and will add 1,000 kilograms of fuel and 2,660 kilograms for 4 Phoenix missiles and the weight of the launch rails. The total mass of the Tomcat would be a whopping 23,498 kilograms. Assuming it takes both aircraft 4 seconds to decelerate and 7 meters from the moment of catching the wire to full stop. Force equals mass time acceleration. F-tom equals 23,498 kilograms times. You know what, you can just pause the video. The point is, the Tomcat's landing force is over 3 times greater than the Phantom's. They didn't just fail to meet the requirements, they weren't even in the same state. The F-14 swing wing hydraulics were large, heavy, and complicated. The 20 knots they took down away from the approach speed by reducing the stall speed, they added back tenfold by their own mass. The Navy was so unsure of the reliability of the actuators that they tested the Tomcat with one wing swept and one wing extended to see if the aircraft was still controllable in such a state. It was, but barely, and the pilots would have to eject instead of land due to safety concerns. This isn't taking into account that the Tomcat's handling characteristics are abysmal by Generation 4 standards, even the Russian ones. When attempting to stabilize on approach, it had a tendency to hunch laterally while trying to achieve a stabilized position. It had spoilers rather than normal ailerons, and it had a high pitch inertia. A study was done by the Naval Postgraduate School to figure out why the F-14 was such a pig to fly, especially at high angles of attack, and officially they couldn't figure out why, because there wasn't enough information or whatever. They couldn't or wouldn't admit that the F-14's wings were poorly designed. Handling issues were only corrected in the 90s with digital flight control systems aboard the little-produced F-14D about 20 years later. There was also the somewhat amusing situation of the F-14 swing wings effectively telegraphing the energy state of the machine to the enemy based on how swept the wings are, since the wings were automatically controlled by the computer. Normally, in a solid-winged aircraft, judging the opponent's aircraft energy state is a very tricky business. The F-14, however, will literally tell its adversary about how fast it was going at that particular moment. It got to the point where Agile Eagle F-4Es were routinely beating F-14As in BFM, something the Navy did their best to cover up. Regarding the vaunted radar of the aircraft, the AN/AWG-9 of the A/B Tomcats were of an analog design, and while I believe that radar to be the only thing that was a significant improvement over the F-4, it was large, heavy, and complicated, like the aforementioned swing wings, apparently a running theme with this airplane. Finally, there are a few minor things to add on. The TF-30s were so far apart that when one engine inevitably stalled, depending on your speed, you would fall into an unrecoverable flat spin. The framed canopy pillars on the F-14 are very thick, and while all-round vision is improved over the F-4, forward visibility is relatively the same. Flying the F-14 is not an easy matter even with the engine upgrades, as most units do not have fly-by-wire, meaning the pilot has to manually trim the aircraft constantly, and it's extremely unpredictable at high angles of attack, which dogfights commonly occur at. At high speeds, the airplane suffers from compression and is excessively stable. The original F-14s featured glove vanes that extended during supersonic flight. The center of lift moves backwards during supersonic flight, forcing the nose down. Some aircraft have clever systems to shift the fuel around, like on the F-106, so the center of gravity moves aft with the center of lift. Grumman tried to increase the lift area forwards of the F-14, but it wasn't as effective as hoped, and in the end it was welded shut, leading to extra dead weight. Overall maintenance on the F-14 is 40 to 60 man-hours per flight hour, which puts it in the same ballpark as Generation 5 fighters, but without the stealthy or highly advanced avionics. Other Teen Series fighters hover around 10 to 15 man-hours per flight hour, and all of them have a wider mission profile. That means a Hornet can sortie as much as 6 times as often as a Timmy-Shat for the same amount of time spent in the shop, and since you could put more Hornets on the flight deck, you can also send out more of them. A painfully enormous consideration, one usually overlooked or not properly contextualized, is the unit cost of the F-14. In 1973, a single F-14A would set you back $38 million, which doesn't sound like a lot until you adjust it for inflation, which would bring you up to a whopping $238 million in today's money. For comparison, the F-15EX costs $88 million per airframe, and the initial F-14 somehow is more expensive than the initial F-35 cost, which ran in at $221 million. In 1988, the F-14 cost $78 million at the time, which is $171 million in today's money. But the F-35A costs $78 million now, a whole $93 million less for stealth, superior capabilities, and an engine that actually works. The Super Hornet currently costs $66.9 million US, and the F-16C costs about $32 million. All these considerations and more are occasionally brought up by articles to appear less biased. The thing is, they quickly gloss over their one cherry-picked design flaw and insist that the Tomcat was worth such a high price. The problem with this belief is that the whole existence of the F-14 was to intercept Soviet maritime bombers, more specifically the original Tu-22. To give some background, during the 60s and 70s, the Soviets were absolutely terrified of an American carrier battle group stationing in the North Sea and making soldiers into mainland Europe from the north in a theoretical conventional Third World War. Ships like the Slava class, Kirov class, and submarines like the Charlie class, Ostrov class, and the Moskva, and an anti-maritime bomber force were all deployed to, at the very least, deny the US Navy from operating in the North Sea. The Navy seems to have effectively ignored the submarines and surface fleet and focused on the bomber threat, something they still do today. During the 60s and early 70s, American ships really only had electronic jamming and chaff to defend themselves from missile attack, and enemy bombers could launch their missiles from beyond the range of shipboard and anti-air missiles, so the concept of a fleet defender on paper absolutely made sense. As a matter of fact, the Sparrow missile was originally designed to be a bomber killer like the Phoenix, and was carried on the Demon and the Phantom, the latter of which was designed with fleet defense as one of its main objectives. Well, there you go, you may say. You're admitting yourself that the F-14 was completely necessary. Well, no, I'm not. The F-3H was originally designed as a regular fighter and was upgraded with Sparrow capability later. The F-4 Phantom was indeed designed as a fleet defender, but also as an attack fighter. It had a much greater utility compared to the dedicated interceptor types everyone was fielding at the time, which is why it was such a dominant design. Both of these aircraft are multi-role instead of strictly focusing on intercepting bombers. Navy ships also began receiving more anti-missile defenses like the Phalanx Seabees in the late 70s, and to this day, only one American ship has ever been successfully attacked by missiles, and that was due to negligence more than anything. With the money wasted on the F-14, the Navy could have and should have swallowed their pride, put into service a few F-111Bs, shored up their anti-submarine defenses, which were a far larger threat, and taken the time to develop a proper multi-role successor to the F-4. In the 80s, Marine squadrons directly transferred from the S-model Phantom to the Hornet, as did quite a few Navy squadrons, such as the famous VF-161 Chargers, completely skipping over the F-14 altogether. One finds it hard to justify the procurement of this extremely expensive side grade, whose very purpose was both so short-lived and the existence so politicized, especially when the fully developed alternative could have done the same job just as well. This is the F-14's greatest Achilles heel. It was designed for a very specific threat, so much that when the threat disappeared, so did its reason for its continued service. It wasn't terribly adaptable to other roles, it was difficult to integrate modern systems into it, and when the work was finally done, it was still inferior to its peers. Upgrading the F-14 was so expensive that the Navy didn't even have the money to pick either precision bombing capabilities or the AMRAAM when it wanted to give F-14s both. Instead, the Lantern targeting pod was jury-rigged to one of the wing missile pylons with an interface card for the reel. Putting the pod on one of the missile points meant that its loadout was down to 2 Sidewinders and 1 Sparrow or Phoenix, along with the assorted air-to-ground munitions in the stations between the engines. As a result, it's not capable of self-escort, not real self-escort like the Hornet, Strike Eagle, Viper, or even the Phantom. For argument's sake, let's say the eye-wateringly expensive proposed Block 1 ground attack upgrade went through somehow. Block 1 was still inferior to the Hornet. It was missing vital munitions like the Harm, the Harpoon, Maverick, Slam, Walleye, JDAM, and JSO. It would not have and could not have been equipped with ground mapping radar, navigation flare, terrain avoidance radar, a moving map display, or radar reconnaissance, which are the bread and butter of air-to-ground missions. The A6E, the F-18C, and the F-18E all have these systems built in as standard. This upgrade would have cost billions, and Block 1 Tomcats still wouldn't have been deployed until 1999 or 2000, by which point the Navy would have started receiving Super Hornets. They still had the audacity to claim that this upgrade was to fill the gap between the Intruder and the Super Hornet. Well, so much for versatility or growth potential. That soft factor's out of the way, and now we get to talk about the fun stuff, raw combat capability. You might be thinking, alright, I read so-and-so pilot's book on the F-14 and it's a dogfight king. The claims that the F-14 can't dogfight are totally unsubstantiated, and if you disagree with me, you're disagreeing with the pilots. Let's just get into it. We'll be breaking this down into 2 sections, which are within visual range and beyond visual range, starting with within visual range. The Tom Incompetent is normally armed with 2 Sidewinders, 2 Sparrows, and 4 Phoenixes. I'll be kind and assume that the F-14 has already jettisoned or shot off the Phoenixes, which still leaves it with an empty weight of its 4 300 kilogram missile rails for the Phoenix. Here are some performance statistics. I'll be comparing the turn capabilities of the F-14A to the Agile Eagle Phantom and the F-16C. The Phantom maintains 14.91 degrees a second, while the F-14A is at 15.5 degrees a second, a negligible increase. The Viper sits at a hefty 19 degrees a second. The sustained turn speed of the Phantom and the Viper are very similar, at 520 knots and 533 knots respectively. The F-14A is the slowest at 323 knots. The peak turn rate energy loss is in the Phantom's favor at 400 feet per second, while the F-16C is at 700 feet per second, and the F-14A is over twice that of the Phantom at 900 feet per second. I'm throwing all these numbers at you now because of the F-4E pilots that were mentioned earlier, kicking in the Tomfat shins. The Phantom and the F-14 rate so similarly that it's down to which pilot manages their energy better, and compared to other Gen 4 fighters, the F-14 will lose against an opponent of equal skill because of how hard it is to fly and how easy it is to lose energy. The F-14 didn't have actual ailerons, it had spoilers. It also had a high lift area. Both factors lead to a lower roll rate compared to contemporary fighters. Adam the Engine Nerd does a good video explaining the physics of roll rate. If you have the time, you should check it out. The F-14A was capable of 229 meters a second of climb. The D was capable of 244 meters a second, and the MiG-29A could do 330 meters a second. The TF-30 F-14As had an abysmal 0.67 thrust-to-weight ratio, and while the F-5 consistently beat the MiG-21 BIS and the MiG-23 during the Soviet trials by having superior aerodynamics despite the lower thrust-to-weight ratio, the F-14 doesn't even have that, which I mentioned before. The TA-4F has a thrust-to-weight ratio of 0.5, but it somehow beats the F-14 in the vertical. One of the countries that showed interest in the F-14 is Israel, the 11th plague of Egypt. A large delegation of Israelis were sent to the US, including IAI engineers, test pilots, and IDF pilots. Israel Bar-Harev, yes I know the name is ironic, flew Mirage 3s and Neshers and has 12 victories to his name. He has this to say about the F-14. When we evaluated the F-14, the US Navy pilots at NAS Miramar told us that the Tomcat could perform equally as well in a dogfight as an A-4. This did not prove to be the case, however, for when I flew the TA-4 against the F-14, the end result of the engagement was an embarrassment for the Tomcat. Not only could the TA-4 outturn the F-14, but during the turn itself, the Tomcat's energy state dropped so low that I was able to fly the TA-4 in the vertical as though the Skyhawk was the superior fighter and the F-14 was the inferior. That puts everything in Top Gun out of the window, I suppose. Asaf Ben Nun, a Kafir test pilot, also had a chance to evaluate the F-14. He said, "The F-14 lacked thrust, was complex and not user-friendly, and was not aerodynamically clean. Indeed, the jet shuddered every time I pulled high G or high angle of attack. During my sortie, I flew DACT, which is Dissimilar Air Combat Training, against Amnon Arad and the Skyhawk, and although we finished with honors even at the end of the session, I found it hard to believe that the F-14 had no edge whatsoever over the A-4 in within visual range air combat." These opinions are backed up by other pilots and the statistics and facts I've listed above. I'm not saying that the F-14 cannot dogfight at all. There's that photo of the F-15 and the F-14 sites that the Tomcat fans gleefully share to say that the F-15 is inferior in close quarters combat. But it's like walking into a melee with a broken leg. Or wing. Yeah, that happened. Its wings and flaps would jam under stress. The torque tubes in the flaps were incredibly fragile for some reason, and the flaps as a whole have a 225 knot max speed and a 2G limit. The chances of jamming increase the greater you push above these limits. Naturally, you cannot sweep the wings back when the flaps are jammed. I cannot talk about the Tomcat's BVR capabilities without talking about the Phoenix missile, so this section will largely be about that missile. The Phoenix is not an anti-fighter weapon. Hughes, as far as I'm concerned, has never made claims that it is, and its design is fairly obviously focused on high-flying, fast, unmaneuverable targets. That hasn't stopped low-traffic news websites from coercing a response from pilots. Some people have it in their heads through various sources and false or poorly contextualized statistics, like the claims that the Phoenix was capable of 30G, that the Phoenix was, in fact, capable of being used as an anti-fighter weapon. Israel wasn't the only nation that showed an interest in the F-14, fleeting as it was. Iran is the only export customer of the F-14, though that was only because the Shah of Iran is an idiot. He wanted the F-14 from the onset, and after a visit from President Nixon to Iran in 1972, the Shah was allowed to pick America's top-of-the-shelf military hardware. The Shah was enamored with the shape of the Tomrat, but to maintain the appearance of a competition, a fly-off was enraged.
In July, another event with an international flavor occurred at Andrews Air Force Base near Washington, D.C. Grumman test pilot demonstrated some of the F-14's low-altitude capabilities for His Royal Imperial Highness, the Shah of Iran. Included in this demonstration were a one-half Cuban 8 on takeoff, a knife edge pass. Here he's pulling 7.5 Gs at 400 knots. This low-speed pass is at 95 knots. A touch and go at 100 knots, then climbing to 1,000 feet. This landing will be less than 2,000 feet of ground roll. The Shah then had an opportunity to have a closer look at production aircraft number 22.
There was a coin toss to decide who went first, and the F-15 won. During its strict 12-minute program, the F-14 pilot set the throttle as far forward as possible and burned off as much fuel as he could, putting the F-14's thrust-to-weight ratio closer to the F-15's. The Navy crew also noticed a wind shear at about 1,000 feet, which reversed the conditions on the ground, so they flew their program in exactly the opposite direction. Their slow flybys appeared much more graceful than the F-15, and the Shah, who was already leaning towards the F-14, completely ignored the Eagle and went over to the Tomcat to talk to the crew, who were still in the cockpit. Politically, I suppose it's a good thing in the end that the Shah was so gullible. The Iranian Revolution in 1978 meant that a puppet ally turned into a firm enemy, and they were left with the incredibly maintenance-intensive F-14s whose parts are increasingly difficult to find. All's well that ends well. In Iranian service, the generally accepted number of kills the Phoenix scored was around 60 to 70, but there's only one trustworthy source, Tom Cooper's book. According to that, only a dozen or so kills appeared to be against high-flying and fast targets such as MiG-25s and Tu-22s, and F-14s scored their lion's share of kills against exports Su-20, MiG-21, and MiG-23 fighters without adequate sensors to detect something like the Phoenix. This is all giving Tom Cooper's book, and by extension Iran's pilots, the benefit of the doubt, of course. Verifying kills is not an easy task to begin with, as pilots tend to overclaim for various reasons, and Iran still hasn't let go of the Iran-Iraq war, so of course they're going to fudge the numbers a little higher than they actually are. While I don't doubt Iran's Air Force scored more kills during the war than Tomcats in American service, the sheer uncertainty surrounding the Iran-Iraq war means that we'll never have credible statistics. In American service, the Phoenix was left in storage for most of its life, except for two incidents. One, on January 5, 1999, two F-14s shot one Phoenix at each at MiG-25s, but both missiles were duds and their rocket motors failed. The other, on September 9 of the same year, was a single Phoenix shot against an Iraqi MiG-23, but the missile missed and the MiG got away, presumably the pilot having learned a thing or two from the Iran-Iraq war. With Iran being discounted for being untrustworthy and the USN not having a large enough sample size, we really can only have the limited data from tests and raw statistics to go off of. The original AIM-54A was capable of Mach 4.3 and had a range of 130 kilometers. Under perfect conditions, but still easier to set up than the Phoenix shot. I'll get into that later. The AIM-7F, M, MH, and P are capable of 80 kilometers or more under the right circumstances. The AIM-57C was a minor upgrade to the hypersonic capabilities that increased a range of 150 kilometers, but this model was optimized for low-flying, unmaneuvering targets like cruise missiles and tactical strike aircraft along the lines of the Super and Dard. As for its vaunted 6-missile track and launch feature, the missile firing interval was intended to be 3.2 seconds between launches, which is kind of pathetic considering the much earlier F-102 Delta Dagger could salvo all 4 of its missiles in that time. However, the minimum time interval found during tests was 6 seconds, and while on one of the later tests it was found to be 10 seconds at minimum. Out of all the tests where only 2 missiles were salvoed, there have only been one on March 8, 1969, where both missiles hit their targets. And out of all these tests, there's only been a single test with a missile that had a live warhead, and it was successful. However, the Navy themselves admitted to rigging the test in the Phoenix's favor and setting the conditions up for an absolutely perfect shot. Remember, at this point, both the Sidewinder and Sparrow were having trouble with reliability over Vietnam, and both are far more simple in design than the AWG-9 and Phoenix combination. By the time this somewhat questionable weapon was put into service, and with tests effectively done only against subsonic drones flying straight and level, the reliability issues of the older missiles had been made into an acceptable level and were far more likely to intercept their intended targets. The Navy was fully aware of how poor a performer it was, but because the Phoenix was the whole reason for the F-14, the survival of the aircraft was linked with the missile's success. They took the paper stats of the Phoenix and told everyone that it was actually capable of it. For example, the commonly sourced number of the Phoenix's range is actually over 190 kilometers, while in practice it's about half that. This is why the Phoenix is still considered to be one of the most capable weapon systems ever developed, despite any actual evidence to back it up. Here's a little test for you. I can't make you do it, but it'll still be fun if you do. Go onto Google, or Bing if you're a serial killer, and look up the F-14 Tomcat. Keep scrolling until you find an article that doesn't paint the F-14 in a very flattering light. You probably won't ever find one. This is a result of years of the Navy's PR department shoving the F-14 down the general public's throat. They're fully aware that the super jet wasn't all that super. After making such a fuss about how bad the Air Force was at building fighters, they themselves built an inferior fighter to the Air Force. I personally wouldn't care, and I'm pretty sure most Americans wouldn't either. But, well, it's the Navy. They just can't let things go. If you want to talk to people about airplanes, they won't really give a damn about the F-15, the F-16, the F-18. But mention the F-14 and people will say things like, oh, it's so cool, or oh, it's a really good fighter. The Navy was careful to try and put the F-14 everywhere. Posters, toys, and most of all, digital media. Basically any movie or TV show that won Navy cooperation had the F-14 featured front and center, and the aircraft made appearances in Airwolf, MacGyver, A Few Good Men, The Final Countdown, The Hunt for Red October, and in video games like Ace Combat and on a poster in Forza Horizon 2, and probably much more that I'm probably missing. I have to admit, it worked really well. If the United States ever became an authoritarian dictatorship, they should get whoever did the F-14's brochure to be the head of propaganda. No one would ever overthrow the government. Look at this, it turned this random British guy into a red-blooded American.
Oh my god. That is awesome!
Splash the zeros. I say again, splash the zeros.
Yes, sir.
Oh my god, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life. Oh my god, yes, yes, get him! USA! 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 Hell yeah! Woo! Get him, shoot him down, shoot the zero now! Yes, you've got him! You've got him! You've got him!
The absolute worst offender, however, was Top Gun. The movie was a massive success, basically playing up to the popular romantic notion of what a fighter pilot's life is like, and poisoning the hearts and minds of everyone who watched it. Top Gun was an excellent way for the Navy to promote their fighter jet to the masses. The other things I mentioned or above were really about the Tomcat itself. Toys usually being some weird knockoff in shows or movies only using the Tomcat as a side prop. The same way the movie Battle of Britain's main character was the Spitfire, Top Gun was made specifically to show off how badass their jet was. When they filmed the training against Skyhawks, the Skyhawk pilots didn't fly the aircraft to the absolute limits of what they were capable of. See, if they did, the A4 would have wiped the floor with the F-14, as mentioned in the Israeli trials, and it would have been a really bad look for the Navy's top fighter to be beat up by a 50s attack jet. The myth that the F-14 could dogfight with the A4 can be directly attributed to this movie. The same applies to the F-5, or the overused unfunny Joko as the MiG-28. F-5s were captured by Russia in the closing stages of the Vietnam War and shipped back to the motherland to be evaluated. In the duels, the F-5 beat the MiG-21 and MiG-23 so spectacularly that the Russians were shaken into focusing their development of fighters into light, technologically simplistic dogfighters, which is a minor reason why their aircraft are generally inferior to Western designs. Top Gun shows the F-14 outmaneuvering F-5s. Well, it all worked. The same way the TV show Stargate boosted enlistment rates to the Air Force, the Navy reported a 500% increase in recruitment the year after the movie was released. Every kid wanted to grow up to be a Tomcat driver. So while F-15s are probably going to be in service for upwards of 50 years from now, the F-14 will live on as probably the most popular fighter jet in history. Which is more important of an allocate is up for you to decide. I know what camp I belong to. I'm not saying it's wrong to like the F-14. Don't let some butthurt kid who can't let go of 50-year-old military politics stop you from what you love. It's alright to like bad things. I'm a huge fan of the A-10 even though that thing is pretty bad. And my favorite tank is the M3 Lee, which is also pretty bad. I just think the F-14 doesn't deserve its reputation, the same way the A-10 doesn't deserve its own cult following. Anyways, there are people who act like their favorite thing is the best thing ever because they like it, and if that sounds familiar, it's probably because they're called wereaboos. There are F-14 fans who think the Navy had a massive downgrade after rearming the fleet with Hornets, and that the F-14 is better than the F-35 or is a credible threat to the F-22. They can't seem to accept that war changes and required roles shift. There's a reason we no longer have dedicated night fighters, battleships, or dive bombers anymore. In a personal admittance of spite, It's always great to see fans of the Tomcat, a machine conceived by politics and infighting, to complain about the F-14's exit from service as a result of politics. Dick Cheney hated the New York congressional delegation, which is fair enough, and he was more specifically hated Long Island, which is where Grumman was located. As a result, he was very pro-Super Hornet and killed the Tomcat over a number of years, starting from not producing more F-14Ds to refusing the Block 1 air-to-ground upgrade package, to finally pulling Tomcats from service. To be fair, the jet didn't really make it hard for Cheney to build a case against it, and so in 2006, the fighter that was put into service out of spite for the Air Force was finally retired out of spite for Long Island. Today, the US Navy really only misses the range of the Tomcat. Super Hornets are capable of buddy tanking, so it's not that big of a deal, and most people in the service don't really look back at the Tomcat, not from a technical standpoint at least. Iran still has F-14s in active service, but I can 100% guarantee you that they're not keeping around because they prefer buying over new jets. It's generally well known that Iran has been trying to acquire illicit F-14 components since the 80s. You could actually write a more compelling movie than Top Gun about an Iranian shell company trying to acquire critical Tomcat components in American possession. But anyways, the problem became so rampant that not only did Congress pass a law in 2008 specifically addressing the issue, F-14s in the boneyard were all unceremoniously scrapped, much like the few F-111Bs so long ago. People tend to use this as another example of how potent an asset of the F-14 is, but to me it just shows how the DoD doesn't see any future for the F-14, even in emergencies. Much like how the mothball fleet is storage for old ships that can be reactivated in times of crisis, the boneyard is effectively the same before aircraft. Considering how quickly and ruthlessly the F-14s were scrapped, the military seems to place its value lower than that of the other aircraft in storage, including hundreds of F-111s nearby.
We are men with a dream on America's team. We're a rugged and ready crew. And you can bet your boots the world looks up to U.S. Air Force Blue. We know where we're going, we set our course. The sky's no limit in the Air Force. You take the blue from the skies and the pretty girl's eyes and a touch of Old Glory's hue. Together we're the men who proudly wear the U.S. Air Force blue. We know where we're going, we set our course. The sky's no limit in the Air Force. You take the blue from the skies and the pretty girl's eyes and a touch of